Welcome back to the Utopias podcast. Today, I'm really excited to welcome a Zen monk, a socially engaged Buddhist, and a very important feminist and environmentalist. Here, I'm speaking about the great Roshi Joan Halifax. And Joan Halifax is the head teacher at the Upaya Zen Center, which is located in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and is been a Buddhist and a practicing Buddhist, as well as an author for many, many years. A lot of this conversation is connected to a very important part of this podcast, which is the importance, again, of thinking about care in terms of care of self and care of others, and the importance of mindfulness, being present, being compassionate, feeling a sense of joy for oneself and for others, and also having the capacity to let go. These are all very, very critical components of Buddhist practice, but in general, what one might call mindfulness practices. And that's a very important element of this podcast, to not just bring voices in from the academic world, the journalistic world, the arts world, but also the world of spirituality, religion, and so on. So this is an interview that we did together, myself and Joan Halifax, back in July 2023. And we discussed Buddhism, meditation, and the importance of that in relation to actually being of the world, acting upon the world from a place of presence and true awareness, deepened awareness. We also talk about climate change and her sort of fervent activist efforts to try to counter climate change. We also talk about technology, true to all of our episodes, technology's impacts on the self, our impacts on our relationships with one another and other beings more generally. So this is a very, very exciting interview. Joan Halifax is in her 80s, yet, as you will hear, is as sharp as it gets, as strong as it gets, and has crossed paths with incredibly profound figures, from the great spiritual teacher Ram Dass to folks like Joseph Campbell, even Alan Lomax, and others. So this is sort of an incredibly powerful and rich voice, bringing into conversation today on Utopias, stories of those who repair, share, and care. I'm coming back into a moment of presence after a morning where I was excitedly planning to speak with a dear teacher and an inspiration to me, Roshi Joan Halifax. Thank you so much for joining me and joining the Utopias podcast, this new podcast this morning, dear Roshi.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you again. Honored to be here. You have an interesting, vibrant lineup of guests. I hope I can meet the standards in some way.
Beyond that, in fact, when I was starting to dream up this podcast, which is appropriately called Utopias, because it's not simply about baseless dreaming, it's about dreaming connected to engagement and practice. Yourself, actually, and Dr. Cornel West were the first two folks who I had some liminal connection to that I wanted to bring on. So I'm very, very grateful for this. I also wanted to mention that literally this morning, my mother and I just did a guided meditation that you led on compassion.
Oh.
And my mother said afterward, and my mother is, normally doesn't have a daily meditation practice. We chant together, we chant like Sanskrit slokas. My mother said, wow, Roshi has a very, very kind and compassionate voice. I said, well, meditation is compassion. So
thank you. I appreciate what you're saying, and I hope so. It maybe depends on the situation. But anyway, here we are together, and your mother is resting in our presence. And how fortunate it is that you are able to be with your mother. Mine is long gone. It's a great blessing to have the opportunity to share intimately with your mother.
And my mother is actually just about 20 feet away from here right now, making sambar, which is a great South Indian lentil soup, because some friends are coming and visiting soon, my family friends, uncles, aunties, and so on. So really grateful to center myself this morning, knowing that I was I was going to be speaking with you. And I was looking up the word Roshi because I just always assumed it meant teacher. And it's actually, from what I read, it means actually a teacher of Zen practitioners, if I'm not mistaken. But maybe I can just start by asking you about that name Roshi. How did that come into your life, and what does it signify, so we can learn about that?
Well, I think the translation is actually means old teacher. I, sometimes kid and I say decrepit teacher. But in any case, I'm not the kind of person who is interested in rank and titles. But in the late 90s, when Glassman Roshi, who was my teacher and a very radical Zen Buddhist, socially engaged, the founder of the Grayston Mandala, and a really intense and marvelous and brave person. So, and gritty, very gritty. And when I say gritty, I really mean gritty. He's part of his practice was to bring us into this mandala called Auschwitz, and we would do bearing witness practice there. He also sat in the charnel grounds of homelessness, of Rwanda and other places of intense suffering. So I really related to Bernie Roshi. He just, at the time in my life when our relationship became more face-to-face, I'd known him for years, but I was really ready to enter into a relationship with, a Western practitioner who had a certain kind of grit, as I use that term, a certain kind of rawness, and someone who was deeply engaged socially and who had a kind of courageous attitude that reflected a lot of my own character. In any case, after we were practicing for some years, we were in Europe on a train and talking to each other. And he said, I want to give you Inca, which is, a process of recognition between a teacher and a student, where the teacher recognizes you as being awake or something like that. And I was like, oi, it didn't land well with me. And I actually didn't say much to Bernie. I kind of laughed, a little bit skeptically, and didn't go any further. And that evening, when I was getting ready for bed and sitting, I realized, just historically, very few women up until that time had been given Dharma transmission at this level. And I thought, I'm, turning 81 in a few weeks. A lot of my life has been in relation to being born into the body of a woman, and working with the lack of gender parity in my own society and encountering that, of course, in Asia to the extreme. And I thought, perhaps I should allow myself or invite myself into receiving this recognition and the title of Roshi, old teacher, not for myself, but for women. And so, I saw Bernie the next day, and you can't refuse it. So it was too late. But, I said, this is the perspective I'm holding. And we both laughed. And that's what it's been for me. It's not been something that has been personally elevating, but it's been a way that I, as a woman and an elder, can be a role model for others. And it's been particularly interesting because I teach in Japan frequently. There are not so many women Roshis in that setting. My lineage is in the Japanese cultural context that is under this wonderful umbrella of teaching of Eihei Dogen, who was born in 1200 and brought Zen over from China to Japan to really revolutionize Japanese Buddhism, which I think he failed at the time. But nonetheless, his teachings have been, profoundly influential for many of us. So anyway, the title was conferred, and I decided that I was going to ask those people who could bear to do it to call me Roshi, old teacher. And maybe I have earned my chops, so to speak, because I've been around a long time, in the practice. But the other thing is whenever you take on a title or are given such a title as one like this, which is kind of a top of the pile title, there is a sense of responsibility that comes along with it. Knowing that when I send my voice in an auditorium or on social media or in the Zendo, it can be perceived to or received with more weight than had I not, been given this kind of title. And that sense of responsibility is not inconsequential. And it's interesting because I'm a politically engaged person. I have very strong views on issues related to justice, environmental justice, social justice, racial justice, gender justice. And so, even as soon as yesterday and again today, I received a blistering communication from somebody in Australia saying, "You are not practicing the middle way." And I just said, I wrote the fellow back, of course it was a guy. Sorry to be gender biased, but I do get dings from women too. And I just said, this is a path I've been walking for over a half a century, and I will walk it till I'm dead. So, and it's not the path of compromise. It's the path of recognizing the truth of suffering, looking at the roots of suffering, and seeing there is a way through. And it has to do deeply with view and aspiration, with how we actually engage the world, and finally, bringing our practice, cultivating a mind that is, clear and hopefully able to perceive reality and be with emergence in a way that is healthy and nimble.
Yes, and what? When I had the opportunity to meet you, it was back in 2018. I can't believe that's 5+ years ago now, at a workshop that you hosted along with Ram Dass and
Frank Ostaseski.
Frank, of course, a great teacher, Frank Ostaseski, and the three of you taught this workshop together. And I had never even been to Hawaii or Maui before. It was incredibly striking to me when I just kind of felt your energy and got the chance to speak to you, that you are bold and strong and clear and stand up for not only what you believe in, but what you believe all of us who are practitioners can stand up for. And I guess what I wanted to do to continue to start our conversation is to take us to that time period. I was there because I was interested in all three of your teachings. I had never been a hospice volunteer or worker, and I realized when I arrived at the retreat or at the workshop that almost everyone around me was working in hospices. And you had recently published a book, which I've read now, Standing at the Edge. And what was very striking for me was not only your presence with these two other great teachers there, and I'd love for you to reflect on that, but also how this, not just idea, but this practice of social engagement in relation to Buddhism. I want to ask you just sort of two parts. One, to take us to that time and that period and place. And second, tell us about social engagement in relation to Buddhism.
Wonderful question, Ramesh. The events where we first met had a kind of interesting background. And just briefly, my friendship with Ram Dass, which originated in the early 1970s, Ram Dass became a beloved friend. And interestingly enough, besides being a kind of spiritual spokesperson and guru and just a sort of really an amazing human being, so brilliant, so mischievous in his delightful way. That friendship was also important in my life because Ram Dass did early work in prisons and with dying people. And of course, in a way, he was a sort of pioneer of the kind of work that I was to do later. And also Frank Ostaseski, who was the other person on stage with us. And so, you could say our godfather, our grandfather, our mentor or something was Ram Dass, no matter, he wasn't particularly a Buddhist, much more Hindu oriented. But nonetheless, we were all great, great friends. And, our work in the field of service and of social engagement, was something that brought us together, but also our dispositions, as you might have noticed. Now, that particular event was something I think was called the Blessing of Mortality.
Yes.
And about a week before the event was to happen, and I was flying into Maui, as was Frank, we got an email from Dasima alerting us that Ram Dass was hospitalized and in the ICU. Now, understand that Ram Dass had a stroke maybe 25 years prior to that, had been in a wheelchair a long time, and had, over the years, very opportunistic infections, and was physically, in a way, very vulnerable, but somehow he prevailed. And Frank and I, FaceTimed each other, and we were like, whoa, well, at least we want to be there with our old friend, because it sounded like he was not going to make it. So he and I arrived at Maui Hospital at the same time and went to see Ram Dass, who'd just moved out of the ICU into a private room and had really serious edema in his one side of his body, but was pretty mentally clear, though he's aphasic because he had a stroke. So, his language capacity was quite limited. And we were really happy to see him. And, in the midst of everything he'd been through, he was very perky. I mean, hovering on the edge of death and still, sort of bright through it all. And with his mischief way, just looking at it, see, like the vultures coming in. Oh, here are the hospice people, Anyway, we talked to him about the program. Lots of people, had registered, and we both, Frank and I, basically said, we're happy to carry on and do this, and not to worry, and don't feel like, that you have to show up or anything. And he just kind of looked at us dubiously. Well, needless to say, later that afternoon, he got discharged. This was on a Thursday. And he came back to the wonderful house he lived in, just on the north shore of Maui. And we had a kind of nice dinner, and I was tired from travel. I was with Frank, and in the morning, we kind of went over. Frank and had the curriculum, what we're going to do. And in the afternoon, early afternoon, Ram Dass said, "I'm going." And we're like, "What? You got to be kidding. Man, you were just about dead a day and a half ago. And, your arm is like this, your legs, I don't know if you saw, how thick it is." And we're like, "Don't do it." And I tell you, if there is a guy who was stubborn, it was that guy. When he decided to do something, he just did it. And so in the middle of pouring rain in the evening, we got RD into the car, and Frank and I and Dasi drove to the church, the Makawao church, and the rain is just pouring. We got out of the car soaking, and wheeled the wheelchair into the church, and everybody stood up, and Ram Dass was rolled down the aisle, and there was rapt silence, and a couple of his assistants lifted him in the wheelchair onto the stage. Frank and I got on either side of him, and he just, for an hour, was darshan. He just rested on that stage in front of those hundreds of people, you among them, and just emanating loving awareness. No language. And of course, Frank and I weren't going to sit there and chat. That would have been a violation of the space. And I was like going, wow. I was in the kind of this cloud of bliss and joy, and that my old friend had prevailed. He'd made it. somehow, he didn't fall into internally some kind of disempowering narrative. He had the kind of heart to meet. And so those were the circumstances. And Frank and I got to throw our curriculum out because RD was in the morning session, I think in the evening, and then the Sunday session. He took the afternoon off to rest, and Frank and I taught during that period. Our friendship, it was over so many decades. He was the real Roshi, he's, talk about elder teacher, and he was decrepit. Buddha knows that he was. One little story that you might not know. He has in the home in Maui, he had this big altar with all the rupas on it, the statues and everything, and images of Neem Karoli Baba, his beloved teacher.
Yes.
And on the altar was a picture of John Boehner, who was then Speaker of the House, and also Trump. And I'm like, whoa.
What?
Yeah. And, this is love all people equally. It's not as if he approved of Trump and Boehner, but it was more that almost like this Thich Nhat Hanh perspective, call me by my true names. It's this such deep compassion for the truth of suffering that the states of mind exemplified by these politicians, so toxic, are not separate from who we are. And the courage that Ramdas had in, including their images on his altar, I just thought was really beautiful. So we had a lot of learning with and through each other in terms of his capacity to accept his own physical and mental limitations with extreme grace, and to not engage in self-pity, just as he would be not engaged in condemning the worst in our society, but in actually understanding the worst in our society, that too is suffering, and feeling compassion.
My experience that first evening when the three of you came in the room was, I just felt like with Ramdas, he was taking it all in and then breathing out, or just being love, right? It had a huge effect on all of us in the room that day, and throughout those days. And maybe we can speak about him, since we've been one more on him, and then I want to speak about other great influences. And with Ramdas, it felt like he was showing us something that I know other teachers have also taught us. For those of us who try to practice meditation, try to practice serving others, being compassionate, following the Dharma, sort of divine path, the path of duty, which is taking it all in, taking it slow, sitting with it, maybe keeping the mouth zipped up from reactivity, and letting it transmute into some practice, into some action, which could be related to thought and feeling, but also, and there's my segue, to social engagement. I don't engage in the way I engage merely out of a quick sort of shallow transient reaction, but I take it in, I breathe it in, I breathe in Brother Trump, as Dr. Westwood called him to me. I breathe in all of that, the hate that's being voiced, and then I feel what I feel, and then that motivates my practice, my what I choose to do with that. Please speak to us about this social engagement coming from depth of awareness and depth of awareness of suffering.
Well, Ramesh, I want to just point out one thing that was so clear. It's slightly related, but it just occurred to me to mention it now. In a way, how we were with Ramdas that night, where it was deeper than language. The few words that were said at a velocity that were very, very slow. Loving awareness was basically, the whole vocabulary. And the way everybody in that audience responded, at least from the point of view where I was sitting on stage, feeling, observing, perceiving, he was inadvertently teaching us how to be, not only with dying, but how to be. How to not put the prefrontal cortex in the front of the room, but to be deeply dropped into bearing witness to not knowing, to not referring to the conceptual mind as the generator of reality and identity. And it's exactly that perspective that one hopes to actualize as you come alongside a dying person. But it's also, for example, I know that experience of working on death row in maximum security in the prison system, not to disavow the presence of intense suffering that both this man has caused others in, taking life and creating chaos in a community, but also his own mind, body, and spirit, the suffering of that. How do we bear witness to not separate ourselves from and to come alongside fully? So it was a really powerful experience of watching a transmission at a preconscious level of what it is to accept the truth of limitations, not as limiting, but as liberating. So I wanted just to make that kind of point that evening. But to speak about social engagement, it has deep roots in Buddhism. From the time of the Buddha, who, when the Sangha was forming, instead of replicating the caste system in India of 500 BC, he flattened out the Sangha completely against, the prevailing tides of the time. And I think that is a very radical move, because hierarchy, of course, is what gives security and power on a social level, and also actually on a psychological level. And he just wiped it out. That was completely radical. Also bringing women into the Sangha, which, thanks to his cousin Ananda, who, intervened and said, let those women join. They are worthy of that, though there are several extra weighty rules that women have to relate to, and they, being disputed at this time in certain circles. But the incorporation of female monastics into the Buddhist Sangha, and the ordination of so-called Dalits or untouchables, the lowest caste, radical, the ordination of a serial killer, Angulimala, and the Buddha's capacity to, be with the most humble of individuals, and of course, friends with King Pasende and other high-ranking individuals. So I look in a way at the Buddha as, someone, from my point of view, who was a social revolutionary. And then later, several hundred years later, came Ashoka. And of course, Ashoka went through a huge Anantya drama where, he was this cruel ruler, warmonger. And during the rout of the Kalinga, Ashoka went into Kalinga and saw the rout, the bodies, the fleeing refugees, the burning buildings, and so forth, put his face in his hands and said, what have I done? And his own transformation process, from being a killer into a Buddhist and spreading Buddhism all the way from the Pamirs to Sri Lanka and to Greece and so forth, and Southeast Asia. So, Buddhism, which was a kind of backwater religion and practice, really took root through the power and vision of King Ashoka, who went through this incredible transformation process and brought vegetarianism, or instituted vegetarianism in India, set up veterinary clinics and did all kinds of good works, which still are reflected in Indian culture. Huge historical influence of a Buddhist ruler who was not a very good person and ended up, going through a moral crisis and transforming his views in a radical way, and instituting that within the Indian social context. And Buddhism has a history of this. And of course, in our time and during my lifetime, it's Mahagosananda who walked the killing fields of Cambodia, Thich Nhat Hanh, who came to our country to beg us to stop bombing the heck out of his country. Sulak Shivaraksha around issues of power and justice in Sri Lanka, Joanna Macy in our country, and Alan Sanoki and others. No, there's a deep continuity of issues that have been addressed in the Buddhist context in relation to injustice and suffering throughout the history of Buddhism. There are also a lot of problems. No religion is free of its problems, Lord knows. But at this point, it's people like myself, the late Bernie Glassman, my friend Alan Sanoki, and many, many of us involved in social and environmental justice issues. And we realize that, our practice is not about just simply sitting on the cushion for our benefit or, help others to awaken, but it really has to do with addressing as well. And this is just one Dharma door, but addressing the issues related to systemic and structural violence. The point of Buddhism at this juncture in this post-pandemic world with the war in Ukraine raging, with the implications in terms of what's happening in North Korea, what's happening in Iran, what's happening in our own economic and political system in this country, we're in a phase shift that is critical, and post-pandemic where uncertainty is at a pitch that is both disabling many individuals, in other words, sense of hopelessness, no future, and boy, climate change and climate justice, climate catastrophe is in our face this very day, whether it's the flooding in the Northeast or the heat in the Southwest, whether it's climate refugees pouring out of these equatorial countries, up, and the injustices in nations closer to the equator up into what they feel is a better world. So I just say we're in it. I feel I was born for these times. I'm approaching my 81st birthday, and that we have a lot of work to do. But what is really essential at this point, Ramesh, I feel for those of us who pass through this Dharma door, is that we cultivate the quality of mind that sees really clearly, and we don't forget. We're here to be of benefit, not just to ourselves, not just to our in-group, not just to human beings, but to all of Earth.
And it's exactly where I wanted to go and to ask you about, which is there are a lot of systems and structures in place that reinforce what maybe I might call a shallow or a very flattened experience of self, right? Like I exist economically in competition with you, or I'm either in this group or I'm out of this group. Certain even economic ideas undergirding game theory that even, the mathematician John Nash was coming up with have undergirded both digital systems, technological systems, economic systems. There's a governance of life contemporarily and now grafted onto this digital world, which is taking over and kind of Pac-Manning almost everything, which is really built around this notion of the self as something that's sort of distinct from other beings, and actually other beings being potentially in competition with ourselves, rather than the deeper relational self, or what. And this is my opportunity to ask you about your friendship and the inspiration of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a huge influence on me. What Thai had called interbeing, saying quite famously, the mud is the lotus, or the lotus is the mud. I'm paraphrasing, right? So even
no mud, no lotus.
No mud, no lotus. Yeah, we used to sing these songs too in the Sangha. So it's even taking it to a beautiful flower in the mud, knowing that they're the same, or that our conversation today is very connected to our ability to be present with one another, but that actually we're all in it together. That's kind of what I'm getting at, right? And that's the basis of a what we may call social engagement or an activist engagement, an ecological engagement, a justice-driven engagement around gender rights, queer rights, racial justice, all of these issues. So what do you think is going on or has been going on with this sort of these different types experiences of self that are being pushed in our lives, right? Especially with the ways in which technologies kind of perhaps distance ourselves from that relational self.
It's a wonderful, wonderful question. You mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh, and I think his vision of what in the Buddhist frame of reference we know as Praticca, another expression is Paratantra, which is interconnectedness, interdependence, and interpenetration. Thich characterizing it as interbeing, which beautiful term, which is now entered into, I'm happy to say, I sort of common parlance, as well as Glassman Roshi's vision of one body, a Buddha of one body. All things are Buddha, one body. And also really coming out of the Macy lectures in the 1930s with Mead and Bateson and Hans von Forster and others, complex adaptive systems. We know that we're not, and Francisco Varela's work,
Yes.
neuroscientist and philosopher,
Brilliant.
that we are not separate. We are in the context of our lived experience. So I'm sitting in this tiny hermitage up at 9,400 feet in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the birds are singing and the clouds are drifting overhead. And I know that I am deeply influenced and in fact nourished by the context of where I am. And also the fact that this very remote valley it's a Bayul, it's a really sacred valley in the Sangres that is completely off-grid, surrounded by 3 million acres of national forest. But Elon Musk and his Starlink, thank you, makes it possible for you and I to interact. So that's part of the context of my lived experience. And it's changing my lived experience moment by moment as we're interacting. So Varela's view of inaction, E-N-A-C-T-I-O-N, not I-N, the inactive view. And so if we do not see this, if we do not realize the truth of interbeing, the inactive perspective from our direct experience, we will continue to extract from the natural world and from each other to our very painful demise. Isn't that people could, engage in climate denial? Well, it's not so easy to do it right now when grids are going offline, when Vermont is flooded, when refugees are pushing on to the shores of Europe, not only fleeing climate, but the economic disparities that they're subject to and the violence within their own countries. And we're not separate from what's happening in Ukraine. We live in a world of cause and effect, of interdependence and interpenetration. And if you don't have that realization, you'll just continue on your delusional merry way, extracting, exploiting, causing suffering to others, and ultimately to oneself. And the notion of a separate self is just the nemesis. I mean, this is one of the fundamental views in Buddhism, to see, to have the realization that we that we are not separate from any being or thing, including the very atmosphere that we're breathing, including the waters of the rivers that are giving us the fluids that we need to keep alive, including the earth that we have extracted so much from, that so many gardens and farms are producing vegetables, for example, that are less nutritious because we've robbed the very earth of its nutrients. And, we're in a real dilemma right now. And there's an external dilemma in terms of, the reality, the physical and the social and the environmental realities that we're in. But we're also in an internal dilemma, a moral dilemma, where we, if we aren't conscious of it at the pre-conscious level, we are all experiencing, no matter whether we know it or not, some degree of moral distress about what is happening on the earth today.
Yes. And also recognizing that certain types of actions that are death producing for other living beings, like the destruction of their habitats, can actually generate new types of life that actually can kill many of our lives, like the pandemic, right? Recognizing that that's a type of life created out of, what my colleague Achille Bembe would call the necropolitical, the politics of death, the politics of division. A sort of quick follow-up is to ask you about your thoughts on that. Many traditions, not merely Buddhist ones, have living practices insofar as they still exist, because we see a vanishing of linguistic diversity and biodiversity around the planet. Astonishing in the last 60-70 years. Astonishing, because linguistic diversity always leaves when biodiversity leaves, because we are living beings and we're animals, and our ability to make sense of different worlds has everything to do with our languages. But as these two things are these two core aspects are vanishing, this big question comes, which is, how do we share and repair, take things that were separated and bring them back together? This planet, and perhaps one reservoir of a great amount of energy are all these different traditions, indigenous traditions, what one might call animist traditions, or, well, I'll be more specific, like Yoruba traditions, West Africa, other practices, which recognize that we live in a web of life of ancestors that have passed on, but are still living with us in a certain sense, or even the realm of ghosts and spirits, or those who have yet to be born in some sort of material or planetary sense or mortality sense. And so maybe everywhere we look, actually, there are practices that can give us that fuel for that recognition of interbeing. And maybe it's just about looking more widely, looking to the past, looking past the ways our lives might be ordered by these screens or by these systems that are kind of behind this, that are in places like banks and markets and so on.
I tend to be a very practical person. And so the metaphysical aspects of of other cultures, or even my own in terms of Christian mysticism and so forth, though attracted me, in various stages of my life, I'm sort of pragmatic. And the pragmatic in me is very interested in what is called traditional ecological knowledges. And these are the knowledges that are, held by those communities and cultures who have, lived in an inactive way, geographies where they have learned how to interact with the geographies and the life forms in these geographies that have been sustainable and generative. For example, years ago, I was in the Lacandone rainforest. And now, the oil companies, thanks to, the money interests, have eaten up a good portion of those forests, and also have, in order to control these lands where there is good oil reserves, have basically bought out many of the Lacandone, just, paid them a lot of money in order to extract oil, destroy the forest and extract oil from their land. But when I was there, many decades ago, the Lacandone planted their fields of slash and burn agriculture, small plots of land where they grew corn and beans and squash, family size, so to speak, not agricultural industry size. The planting was by the calendar of the blossoming of trees. So when such and such a tree blossomed, the Lacandone knew, in terms of the stable weather patterns, this is the time for us to plant the corn, and so on and so forth. Control burning instead of the suppression of fire, which, I'm sitting in this huge fire zone here in the Sangre de Cristos, where there has been fire suppression for 100 years, and bad policy. That policy means that the forest floor is loaded with deadfall, with fuel, There's the crowding of trees. So trees are struggling to survive. And then, of course, the bark beetles come in on these weakened organisms, and those trees die and make the forest even more vulnerable to fire, where indigenous peoples in many parts of the world, engaged in the practice of doing light burning of their forest environments, and on and on. So many examples of this. So part of this, is to turn, not just only to the metaphysical practices per se, but to what informs traditional ecological knowledge in terms of environmental health is the metaphysical, needless to say. And what one learns also from stilling deeply and from observing over long periods of time. I also don't think it's so helpful actually to romanticize, one culture as opposed to another. I mean, I'm very grateful for a good deal of what modern medicine has given to us, what the phenomenologists as philosophers have given to us, which of course has influenced Varela's work. The incredible literature of Western culture, and on. But that we have vilified, ignored, marginalized the knowledge and wisdom of indigenous peoples is, something that has to be rectified. We have a lot to learn from indigenous lifeways. And I use the plural because it's not just one lifeway. We have to be careful not to just, say all indigenous people represent, this particular view. So I want to just sort of mention that in the fray. But I wanted to ask you something, because I know you've been involved with this, looking at this world of AI and machine learning. And, there's a great sort of arising of moral complexity around the application of so-called artificial intelligence. Is it intelligence? Well, it certainly is constructed. It's sort of a doomeristic perspective or a moral perspective. I'd be very interested, because this is like, atomic discoveries by Einstein and Oppenheimer and others, the applications, have, had interesting outcomes, needless to say. And what do you see in terms of ML and AI in vis-a-vis the future?
Yeah, so I'm honored you asked me the question. The history of artificial intelligence was always trying to understand cognition, but really locating cognition generally from a reasoning-based framework. So the idea was, when I was building AI systems, but just sort of the larger history was, how does the mind work? Which is, perhaps a reduction of a deeper self, and basically assuming that the mind is rational, and trying to build software, largely speaking, that could engage in similar reasoning processes. Our big focus at MIT was on common sense. Turns out that that's the hardest thing to try to emulate in the semantic process of building a system. But now what's being called AI is really an extension of what's happening with all dominant platforms, so-called platforms or spaces where we go for social media or search, Google and so on, which is that fragments or representations of human expression, which we call data, are being stored and computed upon because there was a major breakthrough in that they were able to build machines that could store data at exponentially lower costs and crunch that data, essentially compute upon that data, and also at exponentially lower costs. So what that means is we can basically take fragments or patterns of anything that has been quantified as data that's being collected, and then try to emulate that. So that's different than something that's trying to actually do the same thing that they claim the human mind does. It's instead basically trying to it poses or mimics systems like ChatGPT and others. It mimics expression that's out there, but it can appear to be extremely human-like because there's so much data that they have. Note, none of it compensated, not clear what's being taken from us, not clear where that's being taken from, not clear if we have any rights to say, hey, we don't want our data to be collected. Actually, we know that that's not there. And then also the major issue, which is the privatization of something that could have been more, let's call it public. And that started in this particular case as a nonprofit organization. So what I feel, and that was what was driving my questions to you a little bit before, is that these technological regimes are more and more distancing themselves from this sort of interdependency that is of all life. That said, if we know what these are and what they aren't, they can be applied. So I am certainly not a catastrophist at all on any level, but if we know what these are, which are, correlation of data, it could be applied to many themes and questions, as long as it's not seen as some sort of be all end all black box that orders our lives. So you can imagine, with histories of fire data, if you collect the right data in relation to a fire, like soil aridity, or some of the things you mentioned with the forest floor, with kind of being so dry, you can imagine recommendations being provided that can get us on a path that is optimized toward a particular outcome, right? It's a narrowing of questions into a more scientifically formal frame. So in those senses, these technologies are great because they can allow us to learn from patterns, both historically as well as on a sort of ongoing level or on a global level. But it needs to be what it is, rather than this sort of black box that orders our lives and distances ourselves further from one another at a time when we really all, more than ever, as you said, can and should be together, recognizing our fates and our lives are very intertwined. So I'm troubled, in my own work about the desires to leave the only planet Earth species has ever known, or at least the mythos around that. When I'm talking about here, is I'm talking about the privatization of space, rather than seeing it as a cosmos that's part of we are the space, more of a relational. There's a certain kind of cynicism, and at least the media likes this stuff. There's a certain kind of trolling and sort of character sketch stuff about people like Mr. Musk or Mr. Zuckerberg, and they're going to get in a cage fight and blah blah blah. There are these distractions. So what I see a lot of it as is playing to a lot of the characters in this story are absurd. And I think what all of it is doing is taking us away from what I deeply care about, which are all these sort of technological and or scientific breakthroughs, if we want to call that, really locating themselves in our lives. So on a planetary level, like what does computing look like that recognizes our planet?
I think we're in a very interesting time. I'm not a specialist in this area. I'm a Zen practitioner and social activist. So, but I'm interested and concerned about the effects of AI in terms of the promulgation of misinformation, of racial and gender biases, and so forth. But I asked the question because you have a much deeper relationship with that world, and so thank you. I feel more informed as a result of what you've reflected.
You're very correct, though, to say that dominant stereotypes and voices that tend to be white and male and patriarchal tend to infuse themselves into these systems. So various sorts of biases, we could say, or injustices tend to be normalized and extended because it's just technology. We don't really know why it works the way it does, but it's so those things occur. A lot of these digital systems suck up a ton of energy. People don't always recognize that. Server farms, coin mining, all of these things, the rare earth minerals that are, I've gone to try to go to mines in the Congo where coltan is being mined, lithium is a part of this, cobalt. So there's very material effects, and then the other is the effects on labor and questions of economic rights and dignity. A lot of jobs are going to be automated away by private corporations. Some of these, OpenAI, for example, Microsoft invested a lot of money into having some equity, I believe, with the company right after, or, juxtaposed with cutting thousands and thousands of jobs. These are big inflection points for me that really tie actually into your teachings, because I truly believe that we do have these sorts of tools and or I don't know if that's the word, but just these understandings of our interconnectedness, and that technology can serve that as well.
This is out of the box now. And so, it's no dialing this down. I'm very interested, Ramesh, in the work of Abiba Berhane, whom I had the opportunity to meet on various occasions. But, apropos of this, since, AI systems and machine learning, and even, us sitting here in the world of Zoom, I think it's kind of interesting that you use the word utopia, because it actually means no place. It's funny because in a way, the global connectivity has a certain kind of reality, but it isn't embedded in a place. So I just bring that up because I find the word utopia often associated with some idealized state, but actually from the Greek it just means nowhere. And what I think that traditional ecological knowledge is, what we're seeing in terms of the climate catastrophe is, we have to actually, and this is out of Schumacher, local and global, come back to a sense of a place, of embeddedness in our environment.
Yeah, the choice of the name Utopia for this podcast is sort of about a vision of a more borderless world and planet. So it's a more of a almost figurative riff on that, and a celebration of those of us who are working to move beyond this sort of narrow self, the divided self. But absolutely.
I just know, I mean, I'm sitting here in a beautiful environment, physical, natural environment that is so restorative. And I recently was in New York City, which is a place, but it's like my sensory systems were literally just whoa. How do we process this place in terms of a sensory experience? Anyway, I won't get into it. I don't want to run a critique on the name, but no. I think a lot of what the work that I do as a practitioner is, in a way, to not to return to real estate, but to reality. And that reality is, in the context of our lived experience, which is, wherever we are in place. How the world that we're engaging in Zoom, so to speak, but also of AI and ML, where basically you're, as you say, emulation. These are systems that basically reflect the biases and lack of knowledge of those who are putting the data and those data sources within systems that appear intelligent but are not intelligent per se, because intelligence is not just a matter of the prefrontal cortex. There's the intelligence of our lived experience and context.
Yeah, and the systems are not even rational either in even in that limited view of such. And and I think the other point is that they often are producing content that, again, is predicted to grab our attention. Exactly. Which can be done by hijacking different hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, different reactions, right? Dopamine, of course. So there's a neurochemical component to these algorithms as well. Not that they know which, that because they have so much data, they know what content is likely to arrest our attention, and therefore displace us, right? Take us away from place.
Yeah, I had a public conversation with a wonderful man, Eric Schneiderman, who got out of the business, who was one of the main people at Zynga. And we were talking about this, in public, Farmville, which now is, anyway. And, he said right out, I mean, that Farmville was constructed to actually be addictive. And, well, that was very helpful. I remember Tipton Jimpa was sitting in the front row of that conversation, and there's a couple of thousand people there, and I thought, thank you, I really appreciate. And this was years ago when Farmville was a big thing. Probably most people listening right now what that Farmville is, or even Zynga, which is not so present today in the world of games and such. But again, I'm just a meditation practitioner and social activist and environmental activist. I'm not someone, who's able to really do a clear evaluation and be prophetic about, how AI and machine learning is going to affect us down the road. I feel that we, in a certain way, have a responsibility to be at least somewhat informed so that we can not be caught in the grip, in the attraction, in allocating our intuitive and intelligent capacities to machines that are external to us.
Absolutely. That's one of the biggest questions of our time, among many others, and they're all connected. I wanted to ask you just to kind of talk about some of the folks that you've interacted with over the years, and I know that you've crossed paths or collaborated with folks like as diverse as Alan Lomax, the great archivist and musician, I believe, and I've listened to the Alan Lomax archives. Folks like, I believe, Gary Snyder, if I'm not mistaken, Joseph Campbell. So I was a teenager reading The Power of Myth. My father loves that. We watched the Conversations with Bill Moyers, The Power of Myth, the PBS series. You've had a lot of different interactions with all sorts of interesting people and characters and figures that many of us really look up to over the years. Can I ask you a little bit about that, like the path that brought you into Buddhism and your connections with some of these folks that people may describe as beats or artists, poets, and so on?
Well, just to say, Alan Lomax was a major influence on my life. Alan, his father, John A., started the Library of Congress folk collection, and Alan, went all over the world because he was actually a very left-wing, politically engaged person. Thank Buddha. And so he was unfortunately red-baited, and then left the country and collected music from, cultures all over the world. And I met him basically at a time, this was in 1964, during the civil rights and the anti-war movement, of which we were both a part. And then we became friends, and I started working in his archive, Cantometrics and then Choriometrics, and actually developed a computer dictionary for analyzing text cross-culturally at the age of 21, using the Colby's General Inquirer Dictionary and Pierre Miranda's content analysis at Harvard of J. Myths, the computer dictionary he developed. And Alan's thing was, and it's true, he said, and this is partly influenced by the work of Margalef, who wrote, it's Toward an Ecological Theory, on his study of a pelagic reef. And his very important observation that the lack of species diversity could cause immediate collapse of life. And Alan took that model to be true of culture as well, language that you were speaking about earlier, and traditional ecological knowledges that I was referring to, that, the diversity of, biological diversity, but also diversity of culture is really important for human survival and the survival of the planet. So Alan put together this extraordinary archive, and I was part of the research team that analyzed content within the archive, as was Victor Grauer and others, Forestine Paulet, Irmgard Bartiniak. We had an incredible team in the 60s doing this analysis of these cultural expressions based on this view of the importance of cultural diversity. Well, what we see, is a great flattening, the loss of languages, the loss of traditional ecological knowledges, the loss of cultural diversity, and its effect on planetary health. So that, needless to say, in the midst of the civil rights movement, issues around justice, in the midst of the anti-war movement in terms of Vietnam, issues related to violence and nonviolence, all of this, sort of was in the mix of my time with Alan, where, I worked closely with him for 4 years, and then went to Paris, the Musée de l'Homme, the Comité du Film Ethnographique, and ended up doing field work in Africa among the Dogon, and then came back to the University of Miami School of Medicine with a whopping case of hepatitis after a year of, raw living and data collecting in Africa, and then started working in a medical anthropological context. But in any case, my point is that the seminal view held by Markolev and then by Alan and others of his era, why we were working toward, justice in terms of race and war and later the environment. This came out of this very profound vision and out of the data of these early ecologists, but also including the work of Bateson and Margaret Mead, Heinz van Forster, and the Macy lectures, and so on. Alan's influence of my life persists until today. And then, of course, I was very fortunate to work with Joseph Campbell on his historical atlas of world mythology. And Joe had, was always looking for overriding or themes that united traditions and cultures, and received criticism for that. But in the historical atlas, what you see is, a profound expression of human diversity in terms of culture. So I, felt very fortunate in this regard. And then Thich Nhat Hanh in the mid-60s, and then later in the mid-80s, I became his formal student, and this vision of interbeing, interconnectedness, but also to recognize, while every snowflake is a snowflake and has the commonality of water, but it also has its own unique expression. So this notion, that's characterized in Pratishtha, but also in the relationship between the relative and the absolute, the interdependence of the relative and the absolute, which is very at the heart of Mahayana Buddhism, influenced my life very deeply as well. As I said, I'm an older person now, so I've had a chance to meet a lot of people, do a lot of studying, make a lot of mistakes. Fortunately, as I said, I had the feeling not of futility in relation to the future, but of possibility. We can actualize, what we know, but it means a profound transformation in our view of what a self is. And a self is not separate from all others. So and it's really hard in our economic extractive ways to actually come to that. And then there's, early anthropologist David Aberley had this very wonderful, not wonderful, but accurate theory called the principle of the limited good. And that principle, is that there's not enough good to go around. So, you want to kind of bank it up for yourself in order to survive. Well, we know that principle, and Aberley, of course, reflected this perspective that actually there's plenty of good to go around. There's plenty of food, there's plenty of love, there's plenty of housing. We simply have to allocate it out of the hands of the 1% and have an economic system that's just, not only in terms of the marginalized in our societies, but also in terms of our earth.
And there's even Nobel Prize winning economics work that legitimates that perspective, like Elinor Ostrom's great work on externalities and others. So, we have different vocabularies of expressing this vision. And I to the AI question that you brought up. Sometimes me and other colleagues like to say that care is something that's sort of really, really important, and being stripped out of some of these systems that, and actually people again and again and again don't want robots to do care work for them. There have been attempts to build that, but also creativity, right? Because if it's pattern recognition with some emergent components to it, like the way some complex systems can have emergent properties, but the contours of the system are preset. It's not we don't we don't really see these as creative, whatever creativity really is. And so that allows me to ask you this question also about your connections to many creative artists, right? Like, and poets. I know you knew Allen Ginsberg. Am I correct on that? Wow. And people like Gary Snyder, and so you also have interacted with artists and writers and poets and folks coming out of the, I guess what we might call the psychedelic realm or the LSD world. Can you speak to any of those connections to?
I think the role of imagination is something that really needs to be understood. For example, Gary's own realizations came not just from Zen Buddhism. He was drawn to Zen Buddhism by being in the natural world and by accessing poets, early Chinese poets who pointed toward the basic, sort of heart and realization of, sort of Tang Dynasty relationship with mountains, waters, rocks, caves, trees, sky, and clouds. And, then his own poetry really came out of the interrelationship between his direct experience in the natural world. Is, he was reading Hanshan while sitting in a fire tower up in the Northwest. And the notion of, or realization of deep ecology, a different vision of environmentalism came out of that experience, and it's influenced many of us. And of course, it's been one of the prime pieces in the work of Joanna Macy, but his poetry carries that. Allen, as not so much a guy in the natural world, but a guy in, a brilliant, rough, ready, raw 1960s person driven by imagination in a social world that he, felt had a lot of sickness to it. And he just poked into it in, a way that was, I found dangerous and delightful both. But, I cannot say too much about the role of imagination. I think that one of the things that we need to do as we are in this emergent process around the globalization and our climate catastrophe is to allow ourselves not to be enslaved by doomerism per se, by the negative prophecies, but to look for the potentials for transforming greed, hatred, and delusion that's driving the climate change. We also are going to need a lot of imagination and science because, by the way, the tipping points have been reached and gone over. So we are going to have to do heavy adaptation in order to survive the next 100 years. I won't be around, but nonetheless, many will probably, unless more viruses are liberated from their natural worlds. And, and also the nuclear beast is let loose upon the land. So we're in a critical time, and, we have choices, and it's important to make those choices and to be as realistically informed as possible, and also to build community, and also to really come from a place of fierce love. And, it's just not a matter of just patting people on the head. I mean, it's going to take a lot of courage and dedication and care in order to meet this world. And I just want to recommend a book written by my friend, William Dubuis, called The Trail to Conjiroba, where Bill, who is, an extraordinary writer, has written a number of very important books, came along with us to our work in the Himalayas. And he began to shift his own view of what it means to meet an environment that is under siege in a way that is really deep and fresh and generative. And his book is just really amazing. I'm in it, but also so is Charles Darwin. So I would emphasize Darwin and not my role in the book, but it's an extraordinary book with the kind of insights that we've been addressing today. The other book is my book, Standing at the Edge. I just feel that book was really written for these times, where many people want to do their best in engaging transformatively. And it's how to work with the conditions that we're experiencing now in a way that is not going to be disabling, but liberative. And I think so often about Nelson Mandela, who was, a revolutionary and a kind of a really rough, angry man sent to prison for decades and went through an enormous transformation process and turned, toward the ills of his own country and ended apartheid. And of course, we see apartheid rising up again like a beast that just turns upon itself again and again. But I feel we have, some extraordinary individuals on the landscape today who can be role models about, as we face what we're facing in our time. And also the role models are not just amazing movers and shakers like Christiana Figueres drove the outcomes at the Paris climate gathering, but who sends her voice all over the world around the possibilities of the future of turning this climate catastrophe around. But also people like Heather McTeer Toney, who's amazing Black woman from Mississippi, who is addressing issues in relation to climate change, both on the global and the local level. We've got great people out there, a lot of them women doing amazing work. And of course, Dr. West and his voice. I feel hopeful, much in the way that my good friend Rebecca Solnit speaks about hope. We can do this, and it means it's personal will as well as political will to address the issues that we're confronting today. And may it happen.
May it happen. And that's just my final question for you, or just quick comment on, I know you co-founded Upaya, so I wanted to, let listeners know how they could maybe learn more about not just Upaya, but other centers. And, for any of us who are listening or viewing this that feel sort of lost or disoriented or unseen or maybe powerless over these changes, if you can leave us with any parting wisdom, any thoughts, any advice, that would close our conversation too.
Thank you so much, Ramesh. It's been wonderful to reconnect. And, I'm not great on advice, but I will turn to the night chant that we chant at the center as, a really powerful punctuation to the ending of a day. And that chant is, I'll just say the words: life and death are of supreme importance. Time passes swiftly and opportunity is lost. Let us awaken. Do not squander your life. Well, may it be so. We'll all be better for it if we take this admonition to heart. And I thank you for the rich conversation, and I hope it serves.
My appreciation and gratitude. Thank you, Roshi.
The Utopias podcast with Professor Ramesh Srinivasan is produced and edited by me, Phoebe Browse. You can access episodes on all podcast streaming platforms. And if you have questions or comments, please email podcastutopias@gmail.com. Lastly, make sure to join the conversation and stay up to date through following @Ramesh Media S on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. See you all next time.